They say that history is written by the victors. This is one small, yet significant, piece of Civil War history that the victors would have preferred not to have been told. Many historians mention it only briefly and sometimes not accurately. In his epic film documentary, The Civil War, Ken Burns does not mention it at all. It is not a story of glorious battles and thousands of dead and wounded on bloody fields of valor. It is the story of how in times of war, horrendous and militarily unjustified things can happen to defenseless civilians and private property. February 17, 1865 is singularly the most important day in the history of South Carolina and Columbia, the state's capital. On this day, everything changed for the Palmetto State. Politically, economically, socially, nothing would ever be the same. It was the day the wealthy became poor and a beautiful city was destroyed. It was the real Emancipation Day for slaves in a powerful southern state so closely associated with that now universally repudiated institution. No one was spared hardship and loss, neither the rich, the free blacks, nor the slaves. Accusations of responsibility were made and denied immediately after this dreadful day. A government hearing was held. However, the first-hand accounts of soldiers and civilians who were part of this tragedy paint a clear picture of events and motivations unfettered by historical interpretation and explanations. This is the true story of the most monstrous barbarity of the barbarous march.
In early December of 1864, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman and his 65,000-man army reached the Atlantic Ocean, concluding their successful and much-heralded march to the sea through Georgia. As the Union general waited for the inevitable surrender of Savannah, the men in his ranks were guessing what their next move would be. But Sherman knew what he intended to do. He considered Charleston to be a mere desolate wreck following years of naval bombardment. On the other hand, Sherman thought that Columbia, South Carolina's capital, was just as vital to Confederate President Jefferson Davis as Richmond. Major George Ward Nichols, aide-de-camp to Sherman.
Columbia is the center of a number of railroads, which stretch up into the most fertile and fruitful agricultural district in the South. It contains the largest printing establishment in the rebel states. Manufacturers of power, arms, cloths, and other materials are there. Columbia, therefore, is a richer prize and more important capture than any city in the South.
Columbia was also important to Sherman, his men, and the North for another reason. For South Carolina was viewed as the cause of their woes and thoroughly deserved destruction. South Carolina, a Southern political power, had twice before in the early 1830s and 1850s called on Southern states to secede from the Union over the issues of tariffs and slavery. Then, on December 17, 1860, a secession convention began in Columbia. And 3 days later, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union and was quickly followed by 6 other states. On April 12, 1861, the first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Sherman had no doubt whatever as to his future plans after Savannah.
I have thought them over so long and well that they appear as clear as daylight. I left Augusta untouched on purpose, because the enemy will be in doubt as to my objective point after crossing the Savannah River, whether it be Augusta or Charleston, and will naturally divide his forces.
Columbia was Sherman's real target. But on December 16, 1864, Sherman received a letter from Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, Commander-in-Chief of the Union Army, dashing his plans. Grant directed Sherman to establish a base on the coast and, with the balance of his command, come to Grant by water with all dispatch. Sherman responded quickly with 3 letters to Grant within 6 days, respectfully arguing for his plan.
December 16th. Indeed, with my present command, I had expected, after reducing Savannah, instantly to march to Columbia, South Carolina, thence to Raleigh, and thence to report to you. December 18th. With Savannah in our possession at some future time, if not now, we can punish South Carolina as she deserves. I do sincerely believe that the whole United States, North and South, would rejoice to have this army turn loose on South Carolina to devastate that state. It would have a direct and immediate bearing on your campaign in Virginia. December 22nd. I have now completed my first step and should like to go on to you via Columbia and Raleigh. You know better than anybody else how much better troops arrive by land march than when carried by transport.
Ironically, 2 days after Grant wrote his letter to Sherman with the directive for a water route, and before receiving Sherman's first response, Grant changed his mind due to other military victories and the lack of available ships to transport Sherman's army. On December 24, 1864, Sherman received the change in orders and immediately wrote to Major General Halleck in Washington saying that he was now free to make a broad swath through South and North Carolina.
The truth is, the whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. I almost tremble at her fate, but feel that she deserves all that seems in store for her.
By this time, Savannah had fallen peacefully. Unlike Atlanta, which Sherman battled to win and then had evacuated before burning areas of the city, Savannah quietly surrendered and was unharmed. Sherman now turned his attention to preparing for his march on Columbia. He planned to start on January 15, 1865, but the rains so flooded the country that he was brought to a standstill. While Sherman's army was deluged by water, most of Columbia's residents, 120 miles away, continued to believe they were not at risk. The city's population nearly tripled from its pre-war size of 8,000 due to refugees and the assumption that Columbia would be protected from the Union Army. Treasures of all kinds were sent to the city for safekeeping. Columbia also developed a reputation as one of the Confederacy's liveliest cities. At the end of 1864 and into the following year, Columbia's City Hall was the setting of almost weekly concerts of various kinds. While there were shortages of some goods, luxuries of all sorts were for sale in local stores. On December 29, 1864, Columbia Mayor Thomas Goodwin issued a call for fortifications to protect the city. But he received few hands and fewer tools. Instead, residents planned and held a great bazaar on January 17th in the old wooden State House. This lavish 3-day and 4-night event raised money for charity and was attended by thousands, including dignitaries from many southern states, to dine on extravagant cuisine. One attendee called it a Southern achievement of genius.
It seemed that the world and his wife were there, and such a quantity of gold lace never flourished before. If all had been coined, we would have helped many a poor private to their necessary apparel, of which they are now deficient. How the angels flourished and flaunted in before-the-war finery.
While they danced and dined in Columbia, Sherman transported the right wing of his army by ship to Beaufort, where the heavy rains made the roads impassable. Mules and wagons actually sank out of sight. Sherman joined General Oliver Howard in Beaufort on January 21st, while the left wing of his army, under the command of General Henry Slocum, struggled through the rain up the flooding Savannah River. By January 24th, the weather improved, and on January 30th, 1865, the actual invasion of South Carolina began. Not even the severely flooded swamps, impassable roads, Confederate fortifications, or resistance in the state's lowcountry could slow Sherman's troops. Bridges were built, trees were cut, and homes torn down for wood to corduroy the Army's path, as 65,000 men and 2,500 wagons moved forward at 10 to 12 miles a day. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston later said, "There had been no such army since the days of Julius Caesar."
There was a grim determination on the part of the men in the ranks to visit a severe judgment on South Carolina. We practically burned a swath 60 miles wide across. The commanders were powerless. This destruction of property was a matter of revenge. Private John C. Arbuckle, Company K, 4th Iowa Veteran Volunteer Infantry.
The well-known sight of columns of black smoke meets our gaze again. This time houses are burning, and South Carolina has commenced to pay an installment on her debt to justice and humanity. With the help of God, we will have principle and interest before we leave her borders. Where our footsteps pass, fire, ashes, and desolation follow in the path. Major George Ward Nichols.
As Sherman's army was beginning this march, Confederate generals met near Augusta, Georgia on February 2nd to plan a defense. As Sherman expected, the Confederates divided their force, ordering many to protect Charleston. Reinforcements from General Lee in Richmond were requested, but only South Carolina's General Wade Hampton and a division of riders were dispatched to help. With Confederate forces out of position and outmanned, Sherman's columns were now fast closing in on Columbia, averaging nearly 15 miles a day. On February 13th, having ravaged the countryside, destroyed the railroads, and burned the towns along their path, Sherman's massive army was only 21 miles from Columbia. Sherman knew that only a small military force was present in the city, and thanks to his army's maneuvering, many of its citizens still clung to the belief that the Union force was heading to either Augusta or Charleston. In the early afternoon of February 15th, the first and only substantial defense of Columbia met Sherman's forces about 5 miles south of the city at Congaree Creek. For several hours, Confederate troops held their line of breastworks on the north side of the flooding creek. But by late afternoon, after wading through waist-deep water and mud and flanking the defenders, Sherman's men crossed the creek with few losses and made camp within 3 miles of the city, with the Congaree River standing between them and Columbia. While the opposing forces were fighting at Congaree Creek, and with the sounds of battle clearly heard in the city, many Columbia residents were trying to flee by rail. Joseph LeConte received orders on February 10th to ship the chemical laboratory of the Confederate Nitrite Bureau from Columbia to Richmond. The boxes were sent to the depot on the 14th, where they sat until LeConte was able to get them on board a train the next morning. As the fighting at Congaree Creek was ending, LeConte went to the depot again to see if his shipment had been sent. It had.
The depot is still crowded with people trying to get off. The panic is really frightful. Women and children pleading to be taken aboard. It is difficult to see the surge in pleading mass and remain unmoved. It is difficult to resist the strong tide of human sympathy. Still, I try to remain calm. The authorities say there is no danger.
At about midnight, Confederate forces began a light shelling of the Union camp that lasted until morning. While only a few casualties were sustained, Sherman's men did not sleep well. At dawn on February 16th, Sherman's troops were again on the move, and before 9 in the morning, the whole southern bank of the Congaree River opposite Columbia was in their possession.
In all of our campaigns, no other city in the South awakened our interest and bad feeling as did this city of Columbia. And now here it was, with all of its beauty and attractiveness in full view. But with all this was the trouble. There attached to it the bad eminence of having been the first of Southern capitals to lead off in unleashing the dogs of war. The sacrifice, blood, and carnage of 4 years of war through which we had passed were due to what first took place here in the city of Columbia. Judging from the temper and feeling of the men in the ranks, it was evident that a terrible day of retribution had at last come to this beleaguered and doomed city. Private John C. Arbuckle.
The bridge across the Congaree to Columbia was burned by retreating Confederate troops now quartered throughout the city. Positioned at the burned bridge with his artillery unit was Union General William B. Hazen.
The town was already up and in great alarm. The main street leading down to the bridge was filled with citizens and a sprinkling of cavalry, all rushing in evident excitement. Just across the river at easy musket range were the cadets from the citadel, working away like ants with pick and spade at a flank defense for the piers, to be used in case we should try to relay the bridge. They were such young things, mere boys, that I prohibited any firing upon them.
General Hazen did order his battery to fire a few shots up the street at some cavalrymen, while another battery on the hill overlooking Hazen's position opened fire on the trains leaving the station. At about 9 that morning, General Sherman arrived on the scene and directed the battery at the bridge to fire on the railroad station to disperse a crowd carrying away provisions. He then ordered Hazen's artillery crew to fire upon the new granite statehouse under construction.
When the shells struck, we could see the brick and mortar fly. Private John C. Arbuckle.
At the railroad station, the scene was frantic.
Car after car left with the officials of the Treasury Department and hundreds of individuals who feared to be captured by the enemy. Madam S. Sosnowski.
I never saw such a crowd and rush. The car windows were smashed in, women and children pushed through, some head foremost, others feet foremost. Mary Darby de Treville.
Not wanting to risk trying to cross the swollen Congaree under potential enemy fire, Sherman opted for a different route. The Congaree is formed by the Broad River to the north and the Saluda to the west. These rivers intersect at the north end of Columbia. Sherman sent his troops to the only remaining bridge into the city on the Broad River. Along their path, they found an abandoned Union officer prison camp called Camp Sorghum, which had been set up only 4 months earlier.
Here we spent part of a terrible winter, exposed to the storm and rain. We had no shelter save such as we made at last of sticks and logs that we were allowed to carry in from neighboring wood. Our food was wretched. We had almost no clothing, and the weather was very bad nearly all the time. We were surrounded by a line of guards. Union Officer S.H.M. Byers.
The prisoners of Camp Sorghum had been evacuated on December 12, 1864, and moved to the open grounds of the lunatic asylum in Columbia, where many escaped, including S.H.M. Byers, before being taken out of the city as Sherman approached Columbia. About noon on January 16th, Sherman's troops reached the Saluda River and Columbia Mills, the largest manufactory in the South. The bridge across the Saluda had already been burned. By mid-afternoon, pontoons were laid, enabling a division to cross and approach the Broad River Bridge. But just as they arrived, and even before all the retreating Confederate cavalry could cross, the bridge erupted in flames, having earlier been covered with rosin, tar, and turpentine. Waiting until dark, the Union Army began their effort to cross the flooded Broad River in a pouring rain. While Sherman's pontoon corps struggled with their task, Confederate General G.T. Beauregard finalized arrangements for the remainder of his army to evacuate the city early the next morning, turning over the command to Columbia native General Wade Hampton. On February 17th at 3 a.m., a Union brigade was finally ferried across the river, and with daylight began advancing on Columbia under the command of Colonel George Stone. The morning was bright and beautiful, but the soldiers were water-soaked and muddied, having neither sleep nor breakfast. Engineers immediately began laying pontoons for a bridge, while Generals Sherman, Howard, Blair, Logan, and Hazen watched from a high bluff. At 10 o'clock, just as the pontoon bridge was being completed, the city's mayor and several other prominent citizens met Colonel Stone outside the city to surrender Columbia. They received assurances that the city would be unharmed, a promise later reaffirmed by Sherman, with the exception of some public government buildings. At 10:30, Sherman led the rest of his occupying force across the bridge and headed straight for the city. At 11 a.m., as Stone's leading brigade entered Columbia on its main street, the last of Hampton's men departed, leaving a defenseless city of women, children, and old men. All the stores in Columbia, some of which had been looted by Confederate soldiers the previous night, were closely built up for 1 mile down the city's main street, which leads to the old Capitol building and the new one under construction beside it. Bales of cotton were placed down the middle of Main Street by Confederate forces in anticipation of an order to burn them so as to keep the cotton out of Union hands. While the order never came, some bales were reported smoldering or on fire as Sherman's troops entered the city. These were quickly controlled by Columbia residents. There were no fires of significance when the city was surrendered. The Stars and Stripes were raised over the State House dome and on top of the uncompleted State House, while a heavy detail of men was placed on patrol duty.
We have conquered and occupy the capital of the haughty state that instigated and forced forward the treason which has brought on this desolating war. The city which was to have been the capital of the Confederacy if Lee and the rebel hosts had been driven from Richmond is now overrun by Northern soldiers. Major George Ward Nichols.
David P. Cunningham, Union Army correspondent for the New York Herald, described Columbia.
It was famed for its fine public buildings, its magnificent private residences, with their lovely flower gardens which savored of Oriental ease and luxury. It's hard to conceive of a city more beautifully situated or more gorgeously embellished with splendidly shaded walks and drives, with flowers, shrubberies, plantations. Most of its stores and public buildings were of brick, while most of the private residences were framed, neatly painted, with piazzas hanging with plants and creepers, unsurpassed in the elegance of their finish, the beauty of their grounds, and the luxury seemed to pervade the place.
Cunningham witnessed Sherman's entrance into Columbia.
General Sherman, accompanied by several other generals, their staffs and orderlies, forming a brilliant cavalcade, rode into the city amidst a scene of the most enthusiastic excitement. Ladies crowded the windows and balconies, waving banners and handkerchiefs. Negroes were grouped along the streets, cheering, singing, and dancing in the wild exuberance of their newborn freedom. Ringing cheers and shouts echoed far and wide, mingled with the martial music of the bands as they played Hail Columbia, Yankee Doodle, and other national airs. It was indeed an exciting scene.
The discipline of the soldiers upon their first entry into the city was perfect and most admirable. There was no disorder or irregularity on the line of march, showing that their officers had them completely in hand. They were a fine-looking body of men, mostly young and of vigorous formation, well clad and shod, seemingly wanting for nothing. But if the entrance into town and while on duty was indicative of admirable drill and discipline, such ceased to be the case the moment the troops were dismissed. Columbia resident James Gibbs.
This city was full of whiskey and wine, and the colored people who swarmed the streets set it out on the sidewalks by the barrel with the heads knocked in and tin cups provided. Bottles and demijohns were passed liberally to the troops passing through the city to camp quarters. Private John C. Arbuckle.
As General Howard, whose troops were in charge of the city, established headquarters in a house near the university and went to sleep, General Sherman occupied a house not far away on the east side of town. Both were some distance from the troops who had taken over the streets of the city. Until now, Columbia residents had hoped that their fate would be much like Savannah's, where there had been no great destruction of personal property. That hope quickly faded in the afternoon hours.
Our first trouble came about an hour after the entrance, when 2 horsemen rode into the yard and came into the house, saying they had come to look for arms. They ransacked the house and helped themselves to all the small things they fancied. At last they rode off, assuring us that they would call again. Harriet H. Ravenel.
About 2 to 3 p.m., the soldiers began breaking into the stores and banks. The plunder and destruction of valuable property was beyond description. I was passing the Bank of Charleston and the Commercial Bank of Columbia, and found a squad of about 50 soldiers breaking them open and loading themselves with silver to the extent of their ability to carry. Every store in the city was sacked. There was a marked air of absence from all restraint and control. James Gibbs.
Out of fear for their property, residents began requesting Union guards for their homes, and many were granted their requests. Even the Ursuline Convent on Main Street, after repeated personal assurances of safety by Sherman, and just as adamant warnings of doom by Union soldiers, finally requested and received guards from the general. Although neither Sherman nor his officers issued orders for the firing of the city, some Union soldiers warned residents that Columbia would be burned, and even described how rockets would signal for the destruction to begin.
Towards night, crowds of our escaped prisoners, soldiers, and Negroes were parading the streets in groups. David Cunningham.
At dark, the night of terror began. As the signal officers of Sherman's divisions shot off rockets in standard practice to show their locations, fires began to break out all over the city and neighborhoods. Soldiers carried pots and vessels of turpentine, kerosene, or other flammable liquid in which they dipped balls of cotton, lit them, and flung the fireballs over and under houses. The troops charged with patrolling the streets did nothing to stop the rioting.
The streets were crowded with murdering groups of demons from all the corps in the army. David Cunningham.
The boys were spreading the conflagration by firing the city in 100 places. Captain S.H.M. Byers.
Universal license to burn and plunder was the order of the day. Union officer Thomas G. Myers.
Such an awful sight. The street filled with a throng of men, drunken, dancing, shouting, cursing wretches, everyone bearing a tin torch or a blazing lightwood knot. The sky, so dark a half hour before, was already glowing with light, and flames were rising in every direction. Harriet H. Ravenel.
Sherman, who had just finished supper at his headquarters, stepped out into the yard, saw the darkness lit up with the lurid hue of conflagration, and remarked, "They have brought it on themselves." Generals Howard and Hazen went quickly into the streets, ordering soldiers to help fight the fire. Sherman joined them much later in the effort.
True. Generals Sherman, Howard, and others were out giving instructions for putting out a fire in one place, while 100 fires were lighting all around them. How much better would it have been had they brought in a division or brigade of sober troops, cleared out the town, even with steel and bullet? David Cunningham.
The fierce wind, which had been blowing since about 2 that afternoon, was helping to spread the fire, making a tornado of flame. Most efforts to stop the fire were futile. However, the area around General Howard's headquarters, including the buildings on the college campus being used as hospitals, was saved by the work of Union soldiers and hospital workers. Pillaging continued throughout the city. Women and men, black and white, were robbed of their valuables at gun and knife point. Black women were raped. Soldiers pulled children about their beds while plunging long knives repeatedly between them into the mattresses, looking for hidden treasures. Outside, hundreds of men were probing the ground with their bayonets or iron ramrods, searching for buried treasures.
Such a scene. Drunken soldiers rushing from house to house, emptying them of their valuables, and then firing them. David Cunningham.
A crowd had burst in and spread themselves over everything. And from that time until morning, a roaring stream of drunkards poured through the house, plundering and raging, and yet in a way curiously civil and abstaining from personal insult. Harriet H. Ravenel.
The streets were now also full of terrified women, children, and old men seeking safety in the park, lunatic asylum, and other open places to avoid the devouring fire.
Many wandered about, wringing their hands and crying. Some sat stolid and speechless in the street, watching everything that they had go to destruction. Captain S.H.M. Byers.
Shrieks, groans, and cries of distress resounded from every side. Men, women, and children, some half naked as they rushed from their beds, were running frantically about. David Cunningham.
It was a most fearful night. The illumination was more brilliant than I am able to describe. Not only the glare of the flames, but the millions of sparks and cinders that filled the air all helped to make an illumination that far surpassed the brightness of day. The storm of fire raged with unabated fury. James Gibbs.
At about 11 p.m., the students and most of the nuns at the Ursuline convent fled to a nearby church.
We marched through the blazing streets with the precision of a military band. Father O'Connell led the procession, a crucifix held high above his head. The main body of nuns followed, then the pupils, the smaller between the larger for protection. Not a cry, not a moan. Even the drunken soldiers seemed silenced for a little while by this grand sight of church triumphant over war. The roaring of the fire, the scorching flames on either side as we marched down Blanding Street. Sarah Aldrich Richardson.
Midnight came, and a brigade of Union troops south of the city was finally sent into the streets to arrest disorderly soldiers and citizens. About 2,500 men were arrested, including officers of nearly every grade. Because he did not have a pass, even Captain Byers, who had been helping a family escape the fire, was taken into custody. Other soldiers, like Private Arbuckle, who was aiding citizens in the street reach safety, were allowed to remain in the city to help. Yet the pillaging and burning continued by men ruder and fiercer. The guards assigned to the Ursuline convent began their own rampage of the building, forcing the remaining nuns to leave. Fire was falling so thick that it burned the veils and dresses of the nuns on their way to join their sisters in the graveyard of the church nearby.
About 2 o'clock in the morning, the house behind ours and the one across the street burnt down, and ours seemed in such danger that we took the 4 little children, whom we had kept in bed, and my mother took them across the street into the Academy Square, where many burnt-out people had taken refuge. Harriet H. Ravenel.
About 3 a.m., the cross above the convent fell, and an hour later, the winds subsided. Then, with the light, reveille sounded, and the soldiers remaining in the city immediately returned to their ranks.
The 18th of February dawned upon a city of ruins. Nothing remained but the tall, spectre-looking chimneys, the noble-looking trees that shaded the streets, the flower gardens that graced them were blasted and withered by fire. The streets were full of rubbish, broken furniture, and groups of crouching, desponding, weeping, helpless women and children. Oh, that long street of rich stores, the fine hotels, the courthouses, the extensive convent buildings, and last the old Capitol, where the order of secession was passed, were all in one heap of unsightly ruins and rubbish. David Cunningham.
Groups of men, women, and children were gathered in the streets and squares, huddled together over a trunk, a mattress, or a bundle of clothes. Major George Ward Nichols.
The city was a scene of smoldering ruin. Private John C. Arbuckle.
Around the charred ruin of their homes were grouped whole families, mourning and weeping over the terrible desolation. Who could see it and not feel that justice had been avenged in this great curse on the city? Captain S.H.M. Byers.
The truth is, last night our men got beyond our control. General Oliver Howard. I have never doubted that Columbia was deliberately set on fire in more than 100 places. General William B. Hazen.
On the morning of February 20th, Sherman's army marched out of Columbia, leaving behind 500 head of cattle in poor condition to feed the 7,000 remaining residents. All public property surviving the fire had been destroyed, except for the new Capitol under construction, which Major George Ward Nichols thought was because it was such a beautiful work of art.
The Capitol building is far from completion, but if ever finished, it will be the most beautiful architectural creation in this country.
Leaving with Sherman were thousands of refugees, old men, women, and children, blacks and whites, rich and poor, on foot, with packs of every conceivable kind.
Private John C. Arbuckle. In the parks and other vacant places were gathered multitudes of the destitute and homeless. Truly, it was a scene of appalling distress and suffering. As our columns went by, the people gave vigorous expression to their desire for revenge, hissed and hooted, called us vile names, swore at us, spit upon us. Not a few of the women undertook to lay violent hands upon us. While we could not seriously blame them for their abusive words and acts, being mainly innocent sufferers, nevertheless, here was the spot where they had sown the wind, and now at last had come the whirlwind.
Major George Ward Nichols. Columbia will have bitter cause to remember the visit of Sherman's army. Even if peace and prosperity soon return to the land, not in this generation nor the next, no, not for a century, can this city or the state recover from the deadly blow which has taken its life. It is not alone in the property that has been destroyed that the most blasting, withering blow has fallen. It is in the crushing downfall of their inordinate vanity, their arrogant pride, that the rebels will feel the effects of the visit of our army.